Okay, welcome to my online lesson on planes and axes. This is the Edexcel PE GCSE theory curriculum. The reason why I'm doing an online lesson is the students we're teaching are currently not in school and not having face-to-face PE lessons. And there's a few things that I think you'd benefit from seeing rather than just reading out the textbook. For anyone by chance who's not in my PE class who's looking at this, we are following the Edexcel spec. We're looking at chapter 2, movement analysis, planes and axes. We use this Caboodle workbook and it's page 52. So everyone needs to be on around page 52. Okay, so let's get started on our planes and axes. Okay, so we're going to start off with axes. The definition of an axis is an imaginary line around which the body or part of the body can turn. Now I want you to imagine a wheel like we have in the picture. And if you have an axis, as you can see, that goes through the middle of the wheel, as we all know, the wheel will be able to rotate in this or the other direction, but it can't go up or down or anything like that. It can only go around on one plane. That's we're going to talk about that next. So we can't have any other movement other than the one that goes around that axis. Okay, we always draw our planes and axes through an upright body, such as on the picture here. So we have our three axes, 1, 2, 3, just in no particular order there, and they're the three axes that all movements can occur around. So we're going to learn about those three. Okay, so remember that all movement takes place around an axis. Okay, so movements take place around an axis, but they take place in the direction of a plane. Now, the definition of a plane is an imaginary line that divides the body in two. Now, you've got to think of it almost like a sheet of glass that's going through the body. Now, movements are going to take place along that sheet of glass, along that sheet of glass, I should say, in that direction. Okay, so as before, we draw them through an upright body, and the movements that go around axes take place in the direction of a plane. Okay, so as we can see, again, there are going to be three different planes that work around the three axes that we just mentioned before. So the next slide, we're going to start actually learning the names and which goes with which. Okay. Okay, so we're just going to start talking about the axes and planes now. So we're going to start off with the sagittal axis here. Now, those of you that have been taught by me, I often have very, very weird and random ways of remembering things, and that's okay because it helps me remember it. So however you want to remember stuff, doesn't matter how weird or bizarre or whatever, if it helps you remember it, then go for it. So this is how I remember what the sagittal means. So I always say sagittal, it'll go through your belly button. Okay, now obviously that's a bit stupid, but you know what? I just remember it. So it could be something that helps you remember it. So sagittal, it'll go through your belly button. All right, now we can see from the picture here that we have our sagittal axis running through from the front of the body, through the belly button, through the back of the body, and that is your sagittal axis. Now you can see from the green arrows, you can imagine now rotating around this this axis in this direction. Okay, it would go around all the other way, and that is the plane of movement. Okay, so that's what we're going to move on to next. So that is our plane of movement. Plane. Now, how are you going to remember this? This one may be a bit more straightforward. Your frontal plane, remember it's that sheet of glass, I keep saying glass, that sheet of glass that splits the front of your body from the back. So the front of your body from the back is frontal. So that your frontal plane splits this. Okay, now I'm going to show you a little video that helps explain this a little bit more. Okay, so here's a video. I use these things quite a lot when I teach planes and axes, just because it's good for you guys to see the movements a little bit clearer. And if you're watching this, I want you to actually physically do it with your arms. But basically, essentially, we've got a sagittal axis going through a gymnast. Just pause it there. We use gymnastics a lot in this topic. All the planes and axes are readily seen during gymnastics. It's a great sport to use as examples. Often you'll get asked, well, it's quite likely that if you get asked about planes and axes, it will be in reference to a gymnast. Not necessarily, but it will be. But this is just going to help visualize it. Now we can see the sagittal axis, the straw, going through the body. Remember, sagittal, it will go through the belly button. Okay. Now imagine that the only way of moving would be to go around that axis. Now this movement you can see is occurring in the frontal plane. Okay, we can't move forwards or backwards, or we can't twist. We can only move around the sagittal axis in the frontal plane. Okay, now think about what type of gymnastics movements you'd be able to do here. Okay, well done if you said cartwheel. Cartwheel is exactly a perfect example for a movement which takes place in the frontal plane around the sagittal axis. Okay, so I want you to remember that, a cartwheel. Basically, the movements that are allowed are abduction and adduction. So if you lifted your arms out to the side, that occurs in the frontal plane, because you imagine that sheet of glass going across you. So if you bring your arms out to the side, like a star jump sort of thing, then that is occurring in the frontal plane. So any abduction or adduction movements, so things like, immediately come to mind, things like sidestepping when you're playing sport, that takes place around the sagittal axis in the frontal plane. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Okay, so we're looking at the frontal axis now. We've just seen the frontal plane, so we're familiar with this definition. It splits the front of your body from the back. Now, the frontal axis goes through the side of your body, imagining a table footballer. So those table football games that you play, all those little men on the table football have the bar that goes through the side of them. That is creating a frontal axis. Now you imagine that, we immediately know the only type of movement is to rotate forwards or backwards, but around that frontal axis. Now that movement forwards or backwards around that frontal axis occurs on the sagittal plane. Again, a term that we've just come across. The sagittal plane here will go, it will go through from front to back. Okay, it will go through the belly button to the sagittal plane. So any movements you can see on the, hopefully on the picture here, any movements can go either forwards along that sheet of glass or backwards along that sheet of glass around this frontal axis. And I'll show you a bit more next slide. Okay, so here we have our gymnast again. Now we have the frontal axis. So the front axis is going through the side that splits her front and back like a table footballer. Now the only type of movements we can see here going around the frontal axis occur deadly forwards or backwards. Okay, we can't twist here, and we can't abduct or adduct. We can only rotate around the frontal axis like shown, like a table footballer would, along the sagittal plane. Now this gymnast would be performing a front or back somersault. Okay, we're looking at flexion and extension. Any movements that go forwards or backwards. The gymnastics example would be a front somersault. But other examples would be, for example, when you're running and your arms and legs are moving dead forwards and backwards, they are moving in the sagittal plane, and they're rotating around the frontal axis. So there's a couple of other examples, but I want you to remember the front and back somersault with a gymnast. Okay, so that's the sagittal plane is the direction of movement, and the frontal axis movement occurring around. Okay. Okay, our final combination is the vertical axis and the transverse plane. So vertical axis fairly obviously goes through the body vertically from top to bottom. So you imagine a pole going through your head straight down your body. Now you wouldn't be able to, with this pole going through your body, you wouldn't be able to move forwards or backwards. You wouldn't be able to extend or flex at your hip, for example. You would only be able to rotate, like this picture shows, around the pole one way or the other way, but that's the only movements that could occur around the vertical axis, basically spinning around this pole. Now that is called, the direction of movement is called the transverse plane. Now unfortunately I don't have a clever way of remembering this one. I just remember it as the other one. Okay, so the transverse plane, if you know frontal, sagittal, vertical, then you just know that transverse is the other one you need to know. Okay, so transverse plane, as you can see on the picture, basically movements that go around, so twisting movements. Okay, so the vertical axis allows movement around in the transverse plane. Okay, and a video just to show you. So we have our gymnast with the vertical axis going through their head, straight down through the body. Now the only types of movements you'd be able to do would be to rotate around this vertical axis, and this movement is occurring in the transverse plane. Okay, so the gymnastics example would be a spin, or the technical word would be a pirouette. You'd have to learn how to spell that though. So a pirouette or a twist, twist jump, any movement in sport where you're twisting, maybe looking over your shoulder is a good example in sport. When you look over your shoulder, you are rotating your head around the transverse plane around the vertical axis. Okay, so hopefully those videos have helped. Okay, so it is a difficult sort of topic to get your head around, but I promise you this, if you learn what's on this slide you can see now, you'll be able to answer any exam question that they throw at you. Okay, the only things you have to learn are that the sagittal axis provides movement in the frontal plane. Now that movement is abduction and adduction, and the gymnastics example is a cartwheel. Other examples are star jumps, sidestepping, any actions where your arms and legs have to go directly to the side, but our gymnastics movement is cartwheel. Next, you just have to learn that the frontal axis provides movement in the sagittal plane. Now this type of movement is flexion and extension. The gymnastics example are somersaults, but you imagine flexion and extension of your joints happens in forwards and backwards motion. So running, bicep curls, when you go to kick a ball, bringing your leg back and then forwards, that all takes place in the sagittal plane around the frontal axis. And finally, we need to learn that the vertical axis, the one that goes straight through our body from top to bottom through our head, creates movement in the transverse plane, and that allows our body to rotate, for example, a pirouette, or any example in sport where you're having to spin or turn or look over your shoulder, turning around that middle line. Learn that, and then you'll be able to answer any exam question. Okay, so we have an example. We're going to do a couple of example exam questions now. We're going to work through it together, and then I'm going to leave my class with an exam question to do for homework for this week. You might get asked a multiple choice question, and it's just quite simple. Like I said, if you know the combinations and you understand what these words mean, then this is a very, very easy question. Which one of the following are the plane and axis involved in adduction and abduction of the shoulder? I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to think about that. So abduction and adduction of the shoulder. So bringing your arms out to the side. Okay, so if we do that, that's the frontal plane, remember. You just need to work out what axis it is. Well done. If you said C, the frontal plane and sagittal axis. So that is not a difficult question if you learnt the information on the previous slide. That the frontal plane works with the sagittal axis. You might get a multiple choice question which will look like that. Very easy if you understand the terms and you know the combinations. Okay, the next example would be a short answer question. For example, this is worth 3 marks. The picture shows an athlete taking part in a back tucked somersault. Now, the key question here is analyze the plane and axis of movement that takes place in. So analyze the plane and axis of movement that this movement takes place in. So we're looking at a tucked somersault. Think back to our previous information. To complete a tucked somersault, what types of movement are involved? What axis does that happen in, and what plane does it occur in? So I'll reveal the answer on the next slide. Okay, so well done if you said the following. So the movements of a somersault involves flexion and extension of joints. There's your first mark. A good somersault will take place purely in the sagittal plane around the frontal axis. So they're your 3 marks. Now this is quite key for later on. Remember that a good somersault will only take place in the sagittal plane. Okay, a perfect somersault. If you fell over to the side slightly, then we're not performing a perfect somersault. We're not staying in the sagittal plane. Okay. To stay in the sagittal plane would produce a perfect back or forwards somersault. Another example, exactly the same question, but referring to a different action. We are now performing a star jump, and it's the same question. Analyze the plane and axis of movement this star jump takes place in. So before moving on, just have a little think. What types of movement are occurring at these joints? Okay, what type of movements are involved, and therefore what plane of movement is that on, and around what axis is it working? There are your 3 marks. Okay, well done if you said the following. The movements of a star jump involves abduction and adduction of the joints. There's your first mark. A good star jump will take place purely in the frontal plane around the sagittal axis. Okay, our other example was a cartwheel in gymnastics. If I ask you about gymnastics, you're going to need to talk about cartwheel. Now, this, like we just said before on the previous slide, a good cartwheel must take place in the frontal plane. Now, a bad one, for example, if you ever saw me do a cartwheel, it would start off on the frontal plane, but I would then fall forwards. I wouldn't be able to stay on that plane, okay, which would make it not a very good cartwheel. Okay, so a good cartwheel must stay on the frontal plane and not come off it. Okay, finally, an example 9 marker. Now, this is my PE class. This is your homework. You have a week to do. So I'll just give you a bit of help over the next couple of slides. But your task is this: using examples, evaluate how knowledge of different movement planes and axes can assist a gymnast in performing specific movements correctly. Okay, now I want you to be really, really confident if you get a question about planes and axes in your exam, because there's not a lot you need to learn to be able to answer any question that comes your way. Okay, now we're going to help you a little bit with this question, but this is a very, very straightforward question. Certainly to get 6, 7 out of 9. Whether you get 8 or 9 out of 9 depends on how much detail you give. But let's give you a little bit of help before I set you the homework. Okay, we should know that we've got to start our answer with an AO1 paragraph, knowledge and understanding. So here I would expect you to describe what planes and axes are, given the definitions, and then naming what the 3 planes and what the 3 axes are. Very straightforward AO1. It's your knowledge and understanding. Do you know what you're talking about? What are planes and axes? Simple. Okay, next paragraph would be AO2. This is where you apply your knowledge specifically to the question. So you need to explain the types of movement that occur around those 3 axes and in the 3 planes. Now remember we're talking specifically here about gymnastics. The question asks you specifically for those types of movements in gymnastics. So we have covered those examples on the previous slides. Tell me what types of movement occur along the 3 planes and around the 3 axes. That is going to cover your AO2. Okay, now to finish our 9-mark answer, we must have an AO3 section. This is a section that I find most students struggle to fill, normally only writing one or 2 lines. But remember, there's going to be 3 marks available for your AO3. So you need to summarize the points that you've made, just briefly again, and conclude things. But you need to make connections as well. So for example, you must remember or know that a gymnastics performance gets scored based on the quality of their movements. So, for example, I mentioned earlier, my cartwheels are not very good because they don't stay on the frontal plane. I fall off that plane, I fall forwards, which means my cartwheel is not great. So the perfect cartwheel takes place only on the frontal plane around that sagittal axis. So that's something to remember. There are movements in gymnastics which combine axes and planes. So for example, those twist somersaults, you would be moving in various planes and around various axes at the same time. That's what makes those movements so complicated and difficult. But the 3 movements that you have mentioned previously, they must take place purely on the plane intended for those movements to be performed well. Okay, so I hope you liked the video. I hope you made sense of it. I hope the videos helped you understand it. Give this 9-marker a go, please. You can have about a week to do it. More details will be available on Microsoft Teams or via email, however we're sharing it at the moment. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing you soon. And good luck. And hopefully, this slideshow has helped you answer any question you get about planes and axes, because it's very limited what they're going to be able to ask you. Okay, good luck and see you soon.